Another attempt is expected to pass a Republican health care bill. Arkansas's two senators finally speak up on the issue, but how does their position compare with the governor's? A former circuit judge begins a prison sentence for bribery, but an appeal and an investigation continue, and the head of the Environmental Protection Agency visits Arkansas, touting changes in regulations. That's coming up on Arkansas Week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
And thanks for joining us for this weekend's broadcast of Arkansas Week. I'm Michael Heblin, News Director of KUAR Public Radio in Little Rock. I'll be sitting in for Steve Barnes this week. Earlier this week, the Republican leader in the Senate was pretty much ready to give up on health care. But after some prodding from the president, another attempt is going to be made. And that's where we'll begin. Joining me is Jacob Kaufman, political reporter for KUAR. Steve Bronner is an independent journalist, and Ernie Dumas is a columnist for Arkansas Times. And Jacob, first, it was looking like this was going to be dead earlier this week, and we really heard from Arkansas's senators for the first time publicly on this. Tom Cotton, in particular, had been one of the authors of this Republican bill, and when it looked like this was dead, they both spoke out.
Yeah, and it still might look like it's kind of dead, to me at least. The big deal is that Tom Cotton and Senator Boozman were both, it seemed like, probably for, but they never publicly stated, for an effort to repeal a lot of the Affordable Care Act, but also replace it with a whole bunch of provisions that they found favorable. Ultimately, it was determined that Mitch McConnell, that there weren't enough votes. There's a lot has to do with John McCain's medical diagnosis, so he's out of this for a little bit, although they appear to be pushing for a vote next week regardless of having enough votes. But the tension fundamentally has been conservative members of the Republican Party, and as Tom Cotton would call them, liberal members of the Republican Party, have a disagreement about the replacement plan. So there's been some discussion of just doing a straightforward repeal. They've been campaigning on that for 7 years or so. They voted for it a number of times, knowing President Obama would veto it, which he had. So that's the hope, and that's the big change in the politics of it, is that Senator Cotton, at least, has come out recently articulating why he wants this plan to pass, where in the past he was pretty much silent about it. But that's mostly the politics of it, not the policy.
Well, you know, back, you may remember before John Boehner, who was a previous Speaker of the House, who was kind of ousted when he couldn't bring his divergent factions of the party in the House of Representatives along, he said at the beginning of the session that they're not going to be able to repeal and replace Obamacare. They can't do it because the party is too splintered, and they're not involving the Democrats, of course. So he predicted they couldn't do it, and it looks like he's right. You know, when the president insisted they try again on the latest Senate version of the bill, or else, if not, just flat out repeal it and go home and forget about it, and then come back later on. And apparently last night there were negotiations late into the night, and they still couldn't get anywhere on repealing, revising the last version of the bill, which is what, the third Senate version or the second version, whatever it is. So it still looks pretty grim. But you know, this is an important. There's no issue in Washington more important to Arkansas than the health care. That's why we have to, every week after week, keep talking about it, because it's going to affect whatever happens, whether they do nothing, whether they repeal and replace, or repeal and set a deadline of doing it again in 2 years. it's going to have a dramatic effect on Arkansas. Up to 400,000 people are insured. Their coverage would be imperiled. Hospitals would be affected, doctors, and even if nothing happens, and the president says he expects Obamacare to flop, to fail, to crash, and wants it to fail. And I think he can see to it that it does. And I think we're going to see some changes. And I would predict here now that they're not going to pass anything. I'll be surprised if they do. But if they do, if they don't, I think that you'll see that he's probably going to do away with the subsidies, the big legal issue about whether the federal government, whether the Affordable Care Act authorizes the federal government to help people pay for their out-of-pocket expenses, co-pays and deductibles and so forth. And there's a big lawsuit. The Republicans sued over that and got a favorable ruling at the district court level, and they've appealed, but now trying to stop their own appeal. But if they're successful, and I think the president can simply say we're not going to pay for it any longer, that's going to drive up the premiums for people who are on the Affordable Care Act in Arkansas, including the people that Governor Hutchinson is going to move off Medicaid directly onto the pure private exchanges. That's going to make those unaffordable. And so it's going to be a big crash, I think, in Arkansas, which is the leading state in the country. I guess there's some claims that we're number one in the progress we've made under the Affordable Care Act. So there are a lot of other things that can happen. He's told the IRS that they're not to enforce the penalty, the tax penalty on people who don't buy insurance. So all of these things are going to kind of undermine it. So I think you may see in the next 2 years some dramatic changes in Arkansas, which will affect the budget, the Arkansas budget in the future years. The governor's very concerned about that. The governor doesn't want although he's a Republican and has criticized the Affordable Care Act and has endorsed repeal, but he does not want it to happen in anything like the fashion that's going to come down.
Yeah, that was interesting seeing the governor come out speaking on national programs on CNN and NPR. Basically, Steve, very politely telling members of his party that it would create a lot of uncertainty for states and would be a big issue. And he was quoted on CNN saying we need to let the dust settle a bit and some wise heads need to get back together on this.
Well, governors have a different job than senators. And you see that reflected in the way that Republican governors are acting across the country. And Governor Hutchinson is no different. He has to balance the state budget. He can't pass this on to our kids and grandkids like senators can do. And he has, the Arkansas Works, originally the private option, helps him do that. And not only that, but it covers 300,000 people. And he administers that. So he has been leaning on Senator Cotton and Senator Boozman to be very careful about Medicaid cuts and to be very careful about what happens with this whole reform process. Senator Boozman and Senator Cotton have had a kind of a tough balancing act. They have not said much for a long time. Even though Senator Cotton was one of the ones who wrote the bill, he would not come out and say he was for it. Governor Hutchinson said that he was trying to encourage them not to pass it, and he also said that they were working with it. They didn't say it, but he said they were. Eventually, when the replacement bill looked like it was not going to pass, that was the first time you heard both Senator Cotton and Boozman making really any kind of statement about it, and both said they were for repeal only and come back and replace it again in 2 years. Governor Hutchinson was totally against that because that would throw the entire market into complete turmoil. Since then, we did have President Trump bring the Republicans to the White House, encourage them to try to come up with a replacement. And you are seeing maybe even a little different tack now from the senators. It's really a tough balancing act, especially knowing that they already have the votes for it not to pass. So it was really a tough thing politically for them. And it's still, we're going to have a vote in the near future, but whether or not anything actually happens, we don't know.
Yeah, and pretty well the president almost threatening senators of his own party that if you don't back this, there are conservative groups that could come out against you.
And he said, I have a pen right here. I am ready to sign what you send me. Send me something.
And remember, even if the Senate comes along next week and actually, and Senator McConnell can, suppose, maybe do like he did in 2010 and just tell those, there was a handful of senators, remember, the group that was of non-bipartisan people who were working on the Affordable Care Act in the Senate that never did in the House. And finally, McConnell said, no, the caucus, you've got to stop cooperating, stop participating in the drafting of the Affordable Care Act, or else there could be reprisals in committee assignments and so forth. And so they backed off, and no Republicans did it. And I suppose that would be a test of his power if he does that again. And I think he's reluctant to do that. So I don't see how they can pass it. But even if they do pass something next week, just a repeal with a provision that they'll come back in 2 years and replace it. Even if they do that, it's got to go back to the House. And the House now is all 4 of our members of Congress all voted for it, although they were under tremendous pressure here from their constituents who did not want it to be repealed entirely. So it was going to throw so many people off the insurance rolls. Now they've got the best of both worlds. They voted to repeal. They met their commitment. They voted to repeal Obamacare, but they're not going to be held responsible for the impact of it. So in the House of Representatives and in the Senate as well, they've got the best of both worlds. A lot of them have been able to vote against Obamacare again, and they're not going to have to endure the effects of it, they hope.
That is really interesting because objectively this is a failure of the Republican government majorities and of the president and of Senator Cotton, who tried to craft that revisions into the Senate bill to make it appealing to enough Republicans. So objectively he failed at his goal of trying to get the Republican Party to sign on to his bill. But what is the blame in this? What is the fallout for him? Probably nothing or minimal.
Okay, well, on to a story we've been talking about for a couple of years. Key this week, former Circuit Judge Michael Maggio, who had been investigated and eventually reached a plea agreement saying that, yes, he did accept campaign contributions in exchange for lowering a jury award for a nursing home negligence case. He is appealing. He wanted to withdraw that plea, but in the meantime, a judge said this week that you need to go ahead and begin serving your 10-year prison sentence. Jacob?
Yep, so Michael Maggio, we don't know where he'll end up in a federal facility, but he's had some regret over this for saying, admitting that he was guilty. He wanted to withdraw that. But the more interesting things beside this one judge who lowered a jury verdict from a nursing home operator in exchange for these campaign contributions is all the connections that haven't really been totally confirmed or explored. It's who gave him this money. If you accept a bribe, somebody probably gave you a bribe, and other connections. And the people in question, at least, are Michael Morton, the nursing home operator, who's raised money for other people on the bench in the past, and Gilbert Baker helped facilitate that. He's a Faulkner County local, used to be in the legislature. So there are all these people that are involved with assembling the money and moving the money to Maggio that at this point, at least, it's appeared to be off the hook.
Yeah, and Baker being a former, top Republican official in the state. We don't know where the investigation will go or whether or not Maggio might, provide information to the investigation.
Now, of course, it's possible that the argument would be that we gave him money as a campaign contribution, and he chose to lower the verdict. That would apparently, because this has been going on for a long time, and we still don't have a charge. So at this point, even though their names are in the paper all the time, Morton and Baker haven't been charged with anything, and so who knows what's going on behind closed doors. But that's where we are right now.
Yeah.
And regardless, the whole thing points to the difficulties of what we do, how we elect judges. We elect judges the way we elect legislators, and that is by running for office, using campaign donations from people who may end up having a case before you. And that's, there's really no way to get around that, and that will continue to be the case. It's going to probably get more, there's not going to be less money in politics in the near future. So this will continue to be an issue.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. This whole issue. This was not the only one, but there were a number of other judicial ethics issues and campaign contributions going back for the last couple of years that has kind of triggered this movement for judicial reform. And there's been an effort by the Bar Association. It went to the Supreme Court, and so far it hasn't produced anything. But the Maggio bribes and all of that, and all the other judicial campaign contributions in the Supreme Court, the last 3 races, all has kind of triggered that. So, and again, we've been waiting for 2 years for the other shoe to fall in the Maggio case. The assumption was that when he pled guilty, he would turn in evidence on Gilbert Baker and Michael Morton, and we might see other indictments. But and then he tried to withdraw that plea. So I guess the speculation is that maybe now that he's going to serve prison time, that maybe he'll do that and maybe get some leniency. But the big issue, the suspicion was not only just a campaign contribution to judges, but the way it was done. Gilbert Baker set up a whole bunch of political action committees, and then Michael Morton, who is probably the largest nursing home operator in the state, and also has other healthcare industries, and funnels a lot of money to the legislature to influence favorable legislation for his industries. But he wrote a number of checks from various nursing homes, and to each of all of these, and all of them got funneled to Michael Maggio. And that's the most suspicious thing about it. But again, there is apparently no clear evidence that they understood and expected him to reduce that verdict, although he reduced that verdict from $5 million to $1 million immediately after these contributions were made. But so it's a big legal issue. We may never hear the end of it, or this may be the end of it. Who knows?
Yeah, well, worth noting that the attorney for Maggio still has an appeal. It was a 3-judge panel of the 8th Circuit that refused to let him withdraw the plea, but there is an appeal to perhaps the full 8th Circuit or maybe even the U.S. Supreme Court. And Maggio, when he showed up for prison, Channel 4, KARK, had a pretty extensive interview with him in which he said there had been a rush to judgment, and he felt there were a lot of issues that were unfair about this.
That rush to judgment might lay in part on his past behavior. He seemed to be ethically challenged in the past, where he posted on a message board and revealed the mother of an adopted person in his court, and also used some sexist language, and generally was insulting and derogatory to a lot of people, including those that came before his bench.
And he pled guilty. Right. So if there's a rush to judgment, okay, he pled guilty.
Yeah. Well, this week in Washington, a panel appointed by President Trump met to begin looking into elections in the U.S. And Trump's assertion that there was widespread voter fraud, that he would have easily won the popular vote had millions of people not voted illegally in the last election. But we have an Arkansan who is serving on this panel. Steve?
David Dunn, former Democratic lawmaker, is on the panel. He was quoted this week by the Democrat Gazette, indicating that he's, clearly there not to be a rubber stamp for the administration. So he is looking at that from that point of view. That let's wait and see where the facts are. Arkansas was the first state to turn over the information that was requested by the commission that's looking into this.
I think maybe the only state. Is it still the only state that's done it? I'm not sure.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. And that brought some concern. The Secretary of State's office said, well, this information has been requested 200 times. It is public information, and we gave it. It includes some information, but not others. That you voted, but not who you voted for among them. So this will continue to be a big issue, and will come up again and again. Ultimately, we have to wait and see what how the commission goes. But it's really controversial because so many are saying that this is not really an effort to come to to find out what kind of voter fraud is out there. It's actually an effort to suppress certain voting groups. Now, whether or not that's true, we'll have to wait and see. Maybe another commission to study that. But we're still in the middle of it, and it's going to continue to be an issue.
And one of the critiques from Secretary of States around the country, or people who oversee elections and always the Secretary of State, each state, has been that it's an election integrity commission. The issues they tend to care about or they hear about are old election machines, outdated equipment, and we've learned, of course, that people have been trying to hack into voting machines in the last election. But that's not at the center, at least, of what's been brought up with this voter integrity commission.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. I mean, if they're going, and I think maybe David Dunn, the Arkansas representative, he's a friend of Mark Martin. I assume the Secretary of State Mark Martin is the one who got him appointed to got Trump to appoint him to the federal commission. But his interests are, I think, or at least from what I gathered from his remarks, is voter suppression, but also the whole integrity of the elections, because I think 39 states, we now know that apparently there were efforts made by the Russians, or people working with Russians, to tap into the election systems in 39 states that were not all successful. It may be successful in a few of them. But that's a serious matter, and there's been a recognition now that there's some serious problems with the technology. And the Georgia, for example, that they could tap. Some reporter found the computer services company that was handled all the election records in Georgia. He got in there and could tamper with those records, and so they're now trying to fix that. But so there are a lot of problems, particularly with the knowledge that the Russians or whoever have been successful in at least tapping into a lot of election records. If they may not have been successful in influencing the election in those ways, but it's a serious problem.
But Dunn did say that the request for information did raise concerns.
Yeah, pretty tepid though, I think, compared to I guess 49 other states that didn't send the information in. But he said, he wanted to make sure that all the information was kept private and safeguarded, but who wouldn't? So
yeah, and Governor Hutchinson, I think, he kind of deplored the sharing of those records, I think, as well.
Yes, he did. Well, we had the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, President Trump's appointee to the position, Administrator Scott Pruitt, come to Arkansas on Thursday, met with the governor, the attorney general, and Jacob talked about what's the definition of bodies of water.
Yeah, and they didn't release this information to very many media outlets, so I didn't get a chance to see his remarks, but it seemed, from what I could tell from the PR campaign of various state agencies, that it was like a victory tour of sorts, that we had succeeded in peeling back a lot of the repressive federal regulations that we'd heard about during the Obama administration. We're on our way to do that, at least. He gave a speech at the Poultry Federation, for instance, an agricultural lobbying group. But the big news this week was about the waters of the United States, which protects a lot of feeder-type streams for larger bodies of water that are protected. And that's something from the Obama-era EPA that he wanted. There was an extension of EPA protections that a lot of politicians in Arkansas didn't like. So it was it's kind of a celebration of sorts, it seemed like.
Well, I think he had announced that he was going to do that those regulations will be adopted by the previous EPA director under Barack Obama, that they were implemented. They had hearings and everything were finally implemented, and there was confusion about it. Farmers and other industrial groups were concerned. They don't know how it's going to affect them. They insisted it's not going to affect agriculture, but anyway, they're concerned about it. But before it can go into effect, the EPA administrator must go and do these kinds of things, must have hearings and meetings and so forth, before he can actually physically complete the rollback of those, and that's what he was doing here. There wasn't much publicity in advance, so we only heard from the poultry people and a few others, and he got to talk, and the attorney general, our attorney general, and the head of the Arkansas Pollution Control Commission talked. So that's what it was all about, and it was kind of, as you said, but I think it was a kind of maybe a victory lap, and it's a very popular thing, at least with industries in Arkansas, perhaps not with the general public, who I think the law says that they must, the navigable streams must be kept clean. The question is, how far does a navigable stream go? Can you regulate it to the feeder streams? The creeks and everything that runs into the navigable. Can they regulate that? And that's the question. That and so I think Scott Pruitt is saying no, you can't. And that's going to be the rule shortly.
Meanwhile, Governor Hutchinson announced that 76% of the Arkansas bodies of water that were classified as being impaired in 2008 are now no longer impaired. And I guess the question is going to be, did that happen because of the waters of the U.S. rule or in spite of the waters of the U.S. rule? And we'll hear both sides probably give entirely different answers to that question.
Okay, well, with that, we'll wrap it up. I'm Michael Heplin. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.